Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Key Factors to Consider when Selecting and Implementing an ERP System. This is part of our 2024 Not-for-Profit Speaker Series. My name is Jim Holman, and I'm a director at Cherry Bekaert. This webinar will focus helping organizations that think they're in need of a new system to understand the key steps involved in the selection and deployment within the new ERP system. So I'm pleased to introduce our other guest speakers for today. We have from the Kerr Consulting Group, which was recently acquired by Cherry Bekaert, that you'll be hearing from in a few minutes. We have Dan Krishman, Ryan Fleming, and Nathan Curry. So this webinar will be focused in two sections. The first will be one that I'll lead, which is related to ERP selections and success factors in a successful ERP selection process. The second half of the will be covering the implementation of an ERP, key success factors in an implementation and a deployment of an ERP. So our first polling question is, do you believe that your current ERP will successfully serve your organization's needs over the next 3 to 5 years? So you should see a polling question pop up there. The answers that you can choose from are A, yes, B, no, and C, what is an ERP? So what I see is we've got 57% is yes, we've got 36% is no, and 7% don't know what or who ERP is, which we'll get to in just a moment. So going on to our next slide this is how we can define what an ERP system is. ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning and is a term Gartner Research coined in the early 90s when it was really focused on manufacturing and distribution companies. Now, an ERP is basically considered to be the business platform, business software platform that operates an organization. So we've got different approaches to ERPs for not-for-profits and for higher educational institutions. So we'll get right at it. So if you look at the green shapes, the green circles and the orange rectangles, what we'll say is that the green circles are really what should be under the hood or core functionality within your main ERP solution. So this means that there shouldn't typically be integrations, add-on platforms, manual processes that do the green things. Those things within a not-for-profit should be things like general ledger, financial reporting and compliance, budgeting and financial planning, revenue management, accounts payable, cash and bank management. So those are typical functions that you'd expect to find within the core product. So if you look at in the orange section, those are ancillary products that might be found in the ERP if the ERP is a really large platform, say, for example, SAP or Oracle, where they could do really everything. But more mid-market or smaller solutions go with a best-of-breed approach, which each of those orange rectangles represents functionality that we would expect to be fully integrated, which means there's no spreadsheet saving, importing, exporting, things like that. We'd expect that things like between HR payroll, donor CRM systems, grant management, volunteer management, program management, online giving, events, member portal, campaign management. Now HR payroll tends to be external to the core ERP. This is a normal view of what 20 years ago, all of those shapes would have been green circles. So this is just letting you know the way the technology has evolved, that the ERP, because of integrations, are much better and accessible than they used to be. It's more common to have, for example, the event management platform that best suits your organization matched to the ERP you have, as opposed to using events management that you're stuck with the ERP that may not meet the needs of what it is that you're trying to achieve. Within higher education, it's a similar approach. You'll see things within the green area that you expect to find, things like financial aid, budgeting and planning, grants and funds. You'll also see things, for example, in the orange area where there's a lot of complexity. For example, student health services, student information, library information, learning management, student housing, donor management, campus security, research grant management, for example. Other ones that I could have put here but was running out of space are things like ticketing for athletic events or point of sale, for example, for small purchases at the bookstore or at the pop-up marts that sell athletic gear at games. So you could see that the ERP is not expected to do everything anymore because there's some very strong purpose-built solutions that integrate to those ERPs. So if you answered the question that no, you don't think you're on an ERP solution that can take you 3 to 5 years into the future, you may be running what we'll either call, say, an old ERP, or let's call it a legacy ERP. What's the difference? An old one might be one that you've not updated since 2010. Okay, that's old. And there's a high risk factor there too. A legacy ERP is simply one that is up to date, but the architecture, the look and feel, the user interface is not modern anymore. And there's a lot of those that are still out there. So if you look at what are the pain points that we typically see, well, if we define where those inefficiencies land, if you look at the paragraph on the left. So old ERPs create significant operational inefficiencies and strategic limitations for higher education institutions and not-for-profit organizations, making it increasingly difficult to compete in the modern landscape and serve effectively. Very common. Cherry Becker, we do a lot of advisory work for organizations that are struggling with their technology. And those 7 items that you see there on the right, it is a bit of a blend between not-for-profit and higher ed, but there's a lot of commonality there. For example, financial reporting challenges, which if anyone's been through with an old ERP and you've been through an audit, you understand that getting the data out can be incredibly complex. So outside of financial reporting challenges, you've got integration challenges, getting data in and out, data accessibility for reporting and business intelligence, administrative inefficiencies, that's like user management and upgrades and implementations of additional products, compliance and regulatory, technology support and maintenance issues. A lot of the older ERPs are on-premise or hosted, meaning there's servers you have to worry about. And then finally, donor management limitations and student experience issues. We've got clients that struggle with student registrations between their student information registration platform, or for example, during a donor campaign where it's external to the ERP. So these are areas where organizations can struggle that are still in a position where they're using old technology. So going into the Wayback Machine and looking at how did we get here, the top blocks, those top 5 blocks gives you ERP through the decades for not-for-profit. The second row is higher ed, and taking you through the process of within those areas, it's similar to say the way it is in public sector, is that in the 70s and 80s, these were standalone solutions that tended to live in accounting, but you also started to have, say, dedicated hardware mini computers. Perhaps there's some of us that have heard of an AS400, maybe even some of us that have used one. There are still not-for-profit and higher ed platforms that are live today running on the current generation of an AS400 called an IBM Power Platform. So that's still out there. So when you see, say, fund accounting, you start to see client server architecture in the 90s. In 2000, you're starting to see very early software as a service, very early cloud-based products. But where in the commercial sector around 2000 is where you started to see things like Intact or NetSuite that were born in the cloud, that only ever existed within a cloud environment. In the not-for-profit space and higher ed, it tended to lag about 15 years. It tended to be very cloud adverse. It also tended to be a lot of lock-in where, say, in higher education, perhaps that the state university governing board in the state where you are provided some of the ERP, which mandated an older technology. In the 2010s, you're starting to see more cloud adoption and integration in software as a service. And moving into the 2020s, we're really seeing what's called, say, best of breed, or an application programming interface. Perhaps you've heard of an API, where the expectation was that the ERP didn't have to do everything. Let the ERP do what it's really good at, and then bolt those pieces on to augment what the ERP can't do. So this has been a long journey to get to where we are today, where the software is in a much better position to serve the organizations, but understanding that there's a lot of legacy tech that's out in both of those areas. So if you're in a position where you'd like to begin the process of looking for your own ERP replacement, I want to talk a little bit about the risks in a do-it-yourself approach. So what are things that you should look at before you jump into the deep end of the pool and start looking at new ERP systems? So within a not-for-profit organization, what we see is that there's difficulty, generally speaking, in capturing and prioritizing the requirements of your new system. There's also a limited knowledge of modern software as a service ERPs. It's a risk-adverse culture many times that limits decision-making speed. So you get to the finish line, you have your favorite final two ERPs, but you can't pull the trigger because whether it's analysis paralysis or something else, we get to the point where we get 95% of the way through a selection and don't select. And then finally, not-for-profits tend to be understaffed in a lot of cases. So that means you don't have a lot of staff. They have to juggle a lot of responsibilities in a selection, and it leads to demo fatigue. Watching demo after demo after demo, you're just as interested in the process being over as you are picking the right platform. On the higher education side, what we find is there's a lot of silos, bunkers, turf wars, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of entrenched, strong personalities and opinions that makes it difficult to build consensus. So where not-for-profit gets stuck in a selection at the very end, a lot of times in higher ed, the process never gets off the ground because there's no initial consensus on really what's a requirement to begin with. There's similarly a limited knowledge of modern SaaS ERPs. And there's a concern about cost misalignment with a SaaS ERP versus a typical large investment in IT infrastructure. By this, I mean data centers on campus, servers, disaster recovery models. A lot of organizations, a lot of colleges that come to us for help in this area say, I would love to pick a new ERP, but I've got $500,000 of servers I just bought on my balance sheet. So that's a sunk cost that has to be considered when going through these things and asking for budget. And then the last one, as I mentioned earlier, is the potential for lock-in within a state university system. If they're giving you the core financials ERP for free, why would you consider paying for an ERP that you get for free, even if it's not the latest and greatest? So those are all areas and risks within the do-it-yourself approach that you should really know before you start this process if you're going to do it yourself. So thinking as we get into what are the critical success factors within a selection? So what I would like you to do before you start, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on between higher ed and not-for-profit, is to think about key requirements versus organizational strategy. Key requirements tends to be very tactical, very solution and function driven. What are the things that the organization needs to operate? So that's going to be very day in the life. It's very month-end processing, very financially focused, versus the strategic considerations. For example, outside of this ERP, and no college, university, or not-for-profit ever has in their mission statement that they exist to pick a new piece of software. This is a tool to enable your vision. So what is that vision, and how might a type of investment like this get in the way of what your organizational strategy is? So can it help you grow and scale? What if you're trying to be more cloud focused, if there's environmental initiatives, for example, So green initiatives that you could achieve by consuming less electricity. Cloud computing is a great way to do that. But how does that line up with timing, cost, and selection between different choices that you might have? If you look at the third bullet where it says total cost of ownership, which has been lined out because you don't own the software anymore. That software as a service is subscription based, which means, yes, you're going to be paying forever, but it means that you don't have the big upfront investment that you used to. So now TCO is total cost of operation, not total cost of ownership. And I would say that if you want to look at, are you on the right ERP, on the wrong ERP? One rule of thumb is if you own the ERP right now, you're probably on an older legacy ERP. Even if it's serving your needs right now, it's still a really big perpetual infrastructure driven investment. So selecting an ERP, what are the steps? Well, this is one process that we use. It's a bigger process than a lot of organizations need, but depending on your size or complexity, it's not atypical. So what I would tell you here is if you're doing this yourself or you're working with an advisory practice to help you pick one, the most important thing is to have a process. The worst thing that you can possibly do is to jump way down here on the first row and start demoing. That's the worst thing you can do. That breaks the opportunity for consensus. It hinders your ability to gather requirements. And instead of your organization driving the selection process, the vendor drives it. As soon as you get into demos, if you don't have requirements, you don't have budget, you don't have a current state or future state architecture in mind, you've given the keys to the passenger. And you don't want to be in that position because it ends up making it difficult to compare multiple providers against each other. So again, the takeaway here is have a process before you begin. Another key success factor is key requirements. Prioritize and focus on your key requirements. If you're working with a provider, or perhaps you have in the past via an RFP, and they've sent you an Excel spreadsheet with a dozen plus tabs and overall 2,000 requirements in the list, that's the wrong approach to take. No one ever bought a new ERP because they love the general ledger. So think about what are the key requirements that really drive your organization to make it successful. And then how can you focus on the key requirements? And then make sure the vendor is focused on those, because ultimately that's what's going to drive a successful selection or a selection that ends up with a lot of change orders and gaps. Key requirement focused, and then you'll notice in this example, a prioritization of those key requirements. Just because they're on the list doesn't mean they're all must-haves. Some of them you could do without, or perhaps if you're doing a group selection, you may have 10 people involved in prioritization. And how do you handle if 9 say it's really a nice to have and it's a must-have for one specific department? There's different approaches on how you address those things, but the important thing is to have that conversation early in the process. So here's a Gantt chart, a project plan for a selection. This may be longer than what you thought. It may be much shorter, I'm not sure. But what I would tell you is a careful selection, which is what you want. A careful selection takes time. And set your team's expectations accordingly. So what you'll notice as before, initial demos don't happen until about midway through this Gantt chart. And this is for another client where it's an April the 8th through a January the 8th through an April the 8th selection. So set your team's expectation. This is not a 2-week thing. This is not a 1-month thing. This is something that you need to have your process, plan your process, execute the process. If you don't, again, what you'll be doing is shortchanging the results. You'll end up making a selection and not executing a contract because there's one more system you need to look at. Or worse, you end up not actually getting the plane off the ground because no one understands what their role is going to be in the end game. So again, set your team's expectations accordingly. Polling question 2. So what do you think is the #1 reason of ERP implementation failure. And the failure can be anything from a failure to go live or being more than 50% over budget or over time. So there's a lot of projects that go long, that go expensive, or never achieve a live status. So choices are A, lack of leadership commitment, B, poorly defined system requirements, C, insufficient training and change management, or D, inadequate budgeting and resource allocation. So if you guys can take some time to answer that question, we'd really appreciate it. I'll tell you, this list came from Gartner Research. There's about 8 of them. I'll tell you all 4 of these are on the list, which is why there's no all of the above, because that's easy to answer. And it looks like we have the number 1 choice is poorly defined system requirements. And that's actually correct. So that is the number 1 reason for ERP failure. Close number 2 was listed as training and change management, which is actually correct as well. The other 2, leadership commitment, lack of and inadequate planning and resource budgeting and resource allocation, is in the list as well. And we do have one participant that said that they didn't appear, that the poll didn't appear for them. Okay, so in the last part of the selection process, what I'll give you as a handoff to our next group is that knowledge transfer is critical. There's 2 parts of the knowledge transfer I want you to think about. One is going to be related to your ERP selection team. So the small group of professionals that is helping you either work with an advisory practice on a selection, or if you're doing it yourself, that's running your own selection. That team, by the time you make the choice, is going to be extremely experienced and well-versed in the system that you chose. So that's very important that they take the time to transfer the knowledge to the organization that are going to be engaged on the implementation. So think about requirements, how important those are, to make sure everything is documented and prioritized and that information is available to the team. Understand vendor commitments and promises. Record the key decision rationale. Why did we make this final decision? Because you will forget, because ERP implementations are hard. So you want to share your demo insights with users if needed. And then finally, maintain your selection criteria documentation, because there may be some second guessing about why did you go with the first choice over the second choice. And then the other part of knowledge transfer that's also critical is that the provider team, the sales team that you fell in love with during the demos, in all likelihood, they are not doing the implementation. And you need to make sure that the vendor is adequately transferring all of that knowledge that they learned about your organization to their team of professionals that's doing the work. And many times that knowledge transfer doesn't happen very well, which means it feels like you're rolling the calendar back to re-educate a new group of professionals from the provider that you just contracted with to teach the new group of people about what's important and what your requirements are. So very important to understand that. And in fact, we usually use that as part of the selection process, to have the provider candidates explain how they do that, because that disconnect can lead to a lot of distress in the project. So I'm going to turn the mic and camera over to my colleagues at Kerr Consulting. So you're going to be hearing from Kerr Consulting, Nathan Curry, Dan Krishman, and Ryan Fleming. So I'm going to continue to operate the PowerPoint, but I will go off camera and mic. If the Kerr team can go on, that would be outstanding.
Thank you, Jim. Great stuff. We appreciate that. My name is Nathan Curry. I'm happy to join you here. We'll cover implementation in this section. We can go to the next slide. So when implementing an ERP system, there are 4 critical foundational elements that we'll go over in just a moment. The topics we'll cover in this section, the critical foundational elements. We'll talk about common not-for-profit specific challenges. We'll talk about the key implementation components that are needed for successful implementation. We'll get into some notes around system design, some configuration considerations, project team structure, the good one, common failure points, and post-implementation success. Next slide, please. So when implementing an ERP system, as I said, there are 4 critical foundational elements that you'll need to consider. Some of these you'll be able to define yourself in preparation for the project, while others you'll need to collaborate with your implementation partner. Let's go to the next slide and we'll start getting into some of these. Speaking of stakeholder commitment, it's exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, define who are the key stakeholders. Often these are members of leadership, but also you will have champions. Champion is someone who advocates for the project. Typically, these might be department heads, folks that are desirous of change, folks that are positive about the project and who want to drive success. Next slide. Resource allocation. Essentially, these projects are difficult. Implementations are not easy, as Jim referred to. So it's helpful to understand and to plan for implementations. Maybe you have some seasonality in your organization, but it's important to understand that the key stakeholders and your champions will need to allocate time for the implementation, of course, while they're trying to do their normal daily duties. So it will be helpful to outline the authority, who makes the decisions, key communication points, and who's responsible for what in your organization. And your implementation partner can help you with that. Ideally, you want to define, how much time do you have to commit to an implementation? And oftentimes what we see is it varies for organizations. Some folks may have a lot of time, and those folks can join in and do as much of the work as they can. Often this is a result of, especially if there are budget constraints or you're trying to get things handled in a certain way. Sometimes organizations don't have time. There's too much going on. And in that case, if you have a good implementation partner, you can rely on them to do a lion's share of the work. Next slide. Project governance structure. Essentially, how will the project be managed? In just a moment, I'll show you a slide and an example of this. It's important to manage scoping during the end of selection process. It's important to understand change control, how do change orders come about, how do we prevent scope creep, what are the risks involved with implementing a project. Your project manager or your main point of contact will be valuable. Your internal champions will be valuable there. And I will say, as a best practice, it's really important for an implementation. Not all partners will do this, but certainly you'll hopefully have a project manager to help govern how fast the project is moving. Are we on task? A single point of communication flow are all important factors for these implementations. Next slide. And lastly, for this section, change management strategy. So scoping and statement of work creation. Being proactive during scoping to anticipate change orders and subsequent phases is key. So in other words, what I'm saying is, as you go through the discovery process and the selection process, no doubt there should be some excitement. There might be some ideas, and there might be some wish list items that may not fit into the initial implementation. Maybe it's a phase 2 item. The more that you can define out your future state and have a clear vision, the more chance you have of having a successful implementation. Another great question to ask during your scoping is, how will the project be managed? Will we have weekly cadence calls? What will the communication flow be like? Will you be able to compare budget to actual each week during the implementation process? Are we tracking who's assigned which task, and are we on track, or are we behind? During those weekly calls, potential roadblocks will come up, and then of course we can anticipate scope creep. In other words, just trying to constantly be proactive and watching to make sure that we're abiding by the statement of work. And then if there's something that comes up that's outside of the statement of work, do we want to approve a change order? Is it necessary? Does it belong in a subsequent phase? Next slide. Here's an example of an ERP implementation methodology. This is one that we use. Typically, this is for a modern SaaS solution. We would have a kickoff meeting. Now, this kickoff meeting is the kickoff of the implementation itself. So to Jim's point for that knowledge transfer, it's really crucial that while you're having the sales discovery phase and they're learning all of those things about you, that information is passed to the implementation team. Because in this first kickoff phase, typically we will have a functional discovery. This is where we'll really get into the details, really get into the specific use cases, and we'll set a plan for our project. In section 2 there under discovery, we'll workshop some of these things, we'll review the scope, and it's just a constant iterative process of going through and making sure that we're on track for the work that we've outlined and that we're following the project plan. This ensures that our resource alignment is in check and that we're on task there. Once we gather all that information from you in that collaborative process, this will configure the system. And this is where typically we'll start sort of merging. There's sort of some overlap between the configuration phase and section 4, the UAT or user acceptance testing phase. We like to get folks into the system as soon as we can to start training early. If anyone in the audience is ever familiar with these types of projects, some of the old methodology might have been, you might heard of folks running in parallel. So in other words, they're continuing to run their old system while they also try to run their new system. We don't advise that. It's really not a best practice, because obviously you're trying to do your job and you're also trying to maintain 2 different systems. It really is a recipe for failure. So for that reason, we like to get folks involved early in the implementation process, try to get you trained, get you used to the system. And then as you'll go through the user acceptance piece of this, we will test our configurations. We'll go through each of those specific use cases and just make sure that we're on track. And also it gets folks exposed to not only how the system works, but some of the benefits that they'll see. And hopefully, people are typically averse to change. So we try to combat that as you get into the UAT section to get folks comfortable early. And then lastly, of course, we go live, we deploy the live system. And going live really just means at the direction of leadership or in your environment, we've determined, okay, we're ready to go. Stop using the old system. Let's start using the new system. Now, that can be scary for folks. Change is scary sometimes. Getting into new systems is scary, especially because inevitably something won't work exactly as we thought. Invariably, there will be issues. These are not easy projects, but you have to have faith in the process. And if we follow a methodology like this, we'll get through those initial go live hurdles, and then you'll be off to the races. Next slide. I think I'll be turning this over to my colleague, Ryan Fleming.
Yes, sir. Thank you. All right. We can stick on the last slide just for a second before diving into the challenges, but just to start, we'll go through some of the common challenges that nonprofits face when implementing a new ERP system. Knowing these challenges upfront really can allow us to anticipate potential issues and address those proactively, which will lead to a smoother transition. Implementing an ERP isn't just about selecting the system, it's about configuring it to fit unique operational needs, such as handling fiscal periods, meeting grant reporting requirements, managing different types of funds, and lastly, integrating with different systems. So by preparing for these things upfront, we can make sure that the system meets those compliance standards, supports effective reporting, and ultimately strengthens the organization's financial management and donor relationships. So with that in mind, let's look at some of these key areas and explore strategies to set your team up for success during implementation. Great. So we'll start with fiscal year timing. Many nonprofits follow unique fiscal cycles that often align with grant schedules, maybe academic timelines, or other specific requirements. So very important to address fiscal year setup early in the implementation process so that we can make sure the system can support those reporting timelines from the get-go. For implementation timing, it's also typically best to schedule go live during the slowest period of the fiscal year to minimize disruptions. Many organizations, I'd actually say most organizations we talk to, think that they need to go live at the start of a new fiscal year. That's definitely not always the case, and typically it's actually not a great idea. Many modern systems offer the flexibility to go live any month of the year. This allows nonprofits to choose a time frame that aligns with their operational needs. It's very helpful for avoiding, busy periods like year-end grant deadlines, which can only add pressure to the implementation process. So a key takeaway, a key action here, make sure to coordinate with those stakeholders, the ones that Nathan was talking about, the folks across different departments, whether it be finance, operations, programs, so that we can really configure the system to match your current fiscal structures and streamline period closing. Additionally, by considering fiscal workload when planning go live, you can help ensure a smooth transition and avoid disruption, especially in critical reporting and compliance activities. Could go to the next slide. Cool. So let's look at grant reporting requirements and site-specific needs. So we know that grant compliance, often very complex. Each grantor may require different reporting formats, different spending limits, different compliant measures. So it's important during implementation to configure the system's reporting framework to meet those unique standards from the outset. For nonprofits operating through multiple sites or regions, data is often needed to be segmented or configured by location. That configuration can help each site meet its local reporting needs while still supporting the organization's overall consolidated reporting goals. In many modern systems, we can leverage what we call dimension to streamline this process. So dimensions allow us to tag and track data by things like grant, location, program, or really any other attribute, making it easier to pull specific reports without having to create separate accounts or additional complexity. So one of our top tips is to always incorporate early testing, set up data segmentation or dimension strategies to ensure that grant and site compliance requirements are fully met. By configuring and verifying these setups before launch, you'll have fewer disruptions at go live. Next slide. Great. Fund accounting complexity, another area where we see a lot of challenges. Nonprofits often need to track things like restricted, unrestricted, temporarily restricted funds separately, ensuring each is used according to donor and grantor restrictions. Configuring the system to handle those things are important, as it'll impact transparency and compliance. In addition to fund management, many nonprofits oversee a range of projects and activities, each with specific funding sources. So during implementation, you should look to establish project level tracking to maintain accountability for all those programs so that funding and expenses are accurately tracked. And that brings us to stakeholder reporting. So from day one, very important to create reporting templates to address the needs of both internal, but also external stakeholders, offering that transparency into how funds are allocated and spent. So a key action here is to collaborate with finance and program leaders early to design those templates, and that'll translate into consistent oversight and trust with various stakeholders. And lastly, thank you, our last challenge is around integration. While we can integrate all different types of solutions, we'll pick on donor management systems for purposes of this conversation. In this case, it will be important to, we're always thinking about what pieces of data in each system have to be connected. So it'll be important in this example to unify donor data with financial records to track things like contributions, pledges, allocations. And during implementation, this means planning and testing the data integration to ensure all records are aligned. Setting up donor reporting is equally important. Configuring the system to reflect donations and their designated allocations support accurate stewardship reporting, which will in turn strengthen donor relationships and reinforce trust. So one very effective strategy that we've seen is to leverage a sandbox environment during implementation. Most vendors can offer that. Sometimes it comes with it, sometimes at an additional fee, but it's well worth the money spent there. It's basically a copy of your environment, and it'll provide a testing ground where we can validate data flow and integration accuracy without impacting the production environment. So that's while ensuring that that by the time the system is actually live, everything's working as expected and donor data syncs reliably with financial records. And back to Nathan, I believe.
Yep. Thank you, Ryan. We'll go to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about some of the implementation components. One of the key issues that will need to be addressed in any implementation is data migration. That is, what data and how much of it should you migrate into a new system? Early, of course, you want to decide, how much. A lot of folks want to bring all of the data in, and we don't really recommend that. Actually, our best practices recommend that you actually don't bring really any, if you can, don't bring in really anything in other than what's open. And we can take that legacy system or that old system and either create a data repository for you, or you can leave the old system running and you can start with a new set of balances in the new system. Now, oftentimes the standard, I'll say, is 1 to 2 years is about how much we typically bring into a project. But you'll certainly want to ask the questions of any team that you're working with about, how much data will I bring in? Typically, data migration services can be charged separately during implementation too. So be sure and ask, how is that funded? How do we get that data in and how much? You can, of course, leave that old system in place. Now, that's not always the case. So what we've done in the past is we can create a separate data structure for reporting purposes, and you'll have that repository where you can go back, and oftentimes we can even improve on I'll call it legacy reporting, or the reporting from your old system in that repository. From there, it allows you to keep things nice and clean, and oftentimes you get better capabilities there. The reason that we advise these best practices is because pulling data from legacy software systems, and when I say legacy, I mean a system that is running on, say, your own server, or you might own the software, as Jim referred to earlier, or you're running, maybe it's even hosted, but it's running on older hardware or even a new server. It's not a cloud or SaaS environment. It can be a challenge because what we often see is that maybe there's a lack of support. If it's a really old product, maybe there's a lack of support there to understand how the data is structured. Maybe there's a lack of a data dictionary, so we don't really know what data lives where, and so that eats up additional time and research that we would have to do during the implementation. The other consideration is that often these legacy systems have what's called a segmented chart of accounts, where you might have a string of numbers, and each grouping of numbers might mean a department or some other area, as opposed to the modern dimensional setup that Ryan referred to, where you can tag data. So all of this adds up to additional time and expense during an implementation for data migration. It really can be a critical area, and I'll call it a gotcha in some cases, for lack of a better term. So please pay close attention to that. I think we go into Dan next. Yeah, Dan Kirschman, thank you, sir.
All right, thanks everybody. I'll actually start on the last point in the slide, which is the reporting framework. When we do implementations, we really like to start with the end in mind. It's a great way to get buy-in from the group, and also a great way for us to understand how the system should be structured from the dimensional design that Nathan mentioned, all the way through into a report that a stakeholder would want to look at. So Taylor reports can provide stakeholders, such as your board members, your donors, with clear understanding of how funds are used and the outcomes that were achieved. This transparency is crucial for demonstrating organizational performance, attracting new donors, and meeting the regulatory requirements that you guys have to manage. So a well-designed reporting framework is really key, and we usually look at those reports and build back from that system. So if we jump up to the slide, the dimensional accounting setup, this goes back to what Nathan and Ryan have been describing as the new method in which we build an accounting system. So it used to be that we have linear accounts where we have our core account and our sub-accounts that may denote things like departments, locations, projects, funds, grants, etc. And this would usually lead to an unwieldy chart of accounts, where a lot of the modern systems that we work with have moved to is a dimensional accounting setup, where you have just the core account that you work with and the rest of the transactional attributions, again, being fund, grant, location, department, site, activity, task, those become separate dropdowns in the transaction list as data is entered. So by combining dimensional accounting with a streamlined chart of accounts, not-for-profits can track basically each dollar to the very minute detail that you may need that a stakeholder may want to report on. So this approach not only supports detailed reporting, but also provides insight that can drive better strategic decisions across various funding sources and programs. So jumping down to funding structure design, this is really key, I think, for most of us on this call. In the not-for-profit sector, funds are often come with some sort of restrictions. So whether it's designated for a specific program or purpose or left unrestricted, we need to be able to track that and report that at a moment's notice. And I think we all endeavor to try to do this in almost real time. So a well thought out fund structure helps separate these restricted and unrestricted funds. Additionally, many of the new systems provide inter-fund tracking that automates transactions as funds pay on behalf of other funds. So this can really increase visibility across your funds. In addition to that, you may have multiple entities that have to report intercompany transactions. This as well will make things much easier for you. Grant tracking. So the real critical element for us all is grant tracking. Many not-for-profits rely on grants, which come with their own set of compliance and reporting demands. Proper grant tracking helps nonprofits keep up with their requirements by aligning spending, reporting with each of the funders' guidelines. Many of the systems, the cloud-based accounting systems we now work with, have embedded in them basically workflows that allow you to track against a grant and at a moment's notice be able to report exactly what's been posted against that grant. And that actually leads me to the next point, which is workflow automation. Automating workflows, and when I mention workflows, I'm discussing approvals, maybe fund management, or just routine tasks that you want automated in the system. We work very closely with our clients to look at what is the approval matrix across the entire ERP and build those into a automated digital workflow that is ultimately auditable and trackable. Then we also look at what are the repetitive tasks that are the users of the system are having to do. And we look for ways to either write scripts or smart rules, smart events to automate these repetitive tasks to reduce the amount of effort, manual effort that is put into the system to have the great reporting that we want at the end of the day. So if we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so common failures for data migration. The first one is poor testing, right? So we put together testing and training as one of the phases in our implementation. And where we find customers fall short at go live is where they really didn't do thorough testing. The way I describe this is reading the textbook before coming to class, which we all know we did, right? So when you read your textbook, you come to class, you have better questions, you learn the material much better. So when it comes time for the test, i.e. go live, you're ready to go, right? So insufficient testing really leads to lots of errors, retraining, and frankly, a poor experience at go live that often turns into finger pointing in either within the organization or back to the consulting firm. So we harp on it early and often. Poor data migration. As Nathan mentioned, data migration we really limit how data migration is pushed, but in the case where the client absolutely wants their data migrated, really having a framework that allows us to clearly map from the old to the new is key. Because if we don't have that Rosetta Stone ahead of time, we find that a data migration policy when it comes to reporting leads to, frankly, lots of breakdowns. And personally, this is where folks start to lose their job, because you're not getting the output that you want. All right, and I know we're running short on time here. I'm going to just jump over to lack of management. So the final challenge is often a lack of change management. So change, even positive change, can be met with resistance, especially if it's not managed well. Without a clear change management strategy, users feel blindsided by the new system, leading to miscommunications and reluctance to adopt the system fully. So to address this, we need to clearly communicate the benefits of the new system to everyone involved, and do this early and often. That is the way. It's really a cultural change that ultimately transitions the system in a successful manner. Next slide.
Talk a little bit about project team structure. I won't belabor this too long. We talked earlier about, used the word stakeholders and champions. A stakeholder is an executive stakeholder, a project team member, a department head, or end user. And then inside of that stakeholder group, you may have champions. And again, these are folks that advocate for the project. These are your positive, shining lights on a hill, all right, who are trying to combat negativity, combat some of the resistance to change. Folks who really want the systems to succeed, your super users, those types of folks. Also, within your structure, of course, you want to vet your implementation partner. And one great way to do that is, do they speak your language, right? Or as you get into some specific not-for-profit questions, can they answer? How long have they been in business? Do they implement and sell more than one type of software? And one of the most important things to ask them, how many consultants do they have that are dedicated to your specific industry? And lastly, of course, Jim touched on the knowledge transfer. Be sure and ask those questions. How is knowledge transferred from the sales team to the implementation team? You don't want to spend too many hours trying to repeat yourself based on the weeks that you spent during the selection process. Ryan, next slide.
All right, so want to talk strategy on cutover. It's very important to plan for this, make sure there's a smooth transition when moving from the old system to the new one. The goal is to establish a clear cutover plan. It's going to minimize disruption, help your organization hit the ground running on go live day. A common question that we hear, and we've talked about it a little bit today, is whether to run both the old system and new system in parallel during transition. Running parallel systems was often a standard approach in the past, typically because older systems lacked the reliability and data integrity that we have today. But with the newer generation of systems, running in parallel is generally not recommended. It can add to unnecessary complexity, increase the risk of data inconsistencies, and create confusion. Plus, when teams encounter challenges, they may fall back on the old system, slowing down the adoption of the new one. That's why a well-prepared cutover plan combined with thorough testing and pre-launch data validation is key to building confidence in the new system without relying on parallel processes. So the key action here is to work closely with your implementation partner and team to map out the cutover process, cover data migration, validation, and immediate support for go live day. With the right preparation, your team will be far more confident in transitioning to the new system without looking back. And the next slide, training, critical part of successful implementation. It's important to ensure that your implementation partner offers a variety of options to match different learning styles and skill levels within your team. So ideally, training should include self-paced learning options so that users can access materials and learn at their own speed. Instructor-led training sessions are also valuable for users who prefer interactive guided learning with a chance to ask questions directly. Some organizations may also offer certification programs, which can be a great way to validate skills and build user confidence. And learning packages that provide ongoing access to training materials can help keep users up to date on new features that are released over time. So, the best approach is usually a blend of these options so that every user has access to the resources that fit their needs, and choosing an implementation partner who can provide this range of training support definitely helps to ensure everyone on your team feels confident in using the next system. And lastly, let's talk about the types of support services to look from your vendor. So having a strong support structure is essential, not just at go live, but throughout the system's life cycle. So to start, it's helpful if your vendor offers self-service resources, like a well-stocked help center with support articles, user guides, information on software updates. Many vendors also provide access to a community of users or experts where people can share solutions, learn best practices. That kind of peer interaction can also be very invaluable as your team becomes more familiar with the system. In terms of support structure, look for a vendor that offers tiered support, some things from basic troubleshooting to advanced support for complex issues and escalation to the software provider if needed. And then clear communication channels are also important. Options like email, a support portal, or phone access make it a lot easier to get help when needed. One thing to keep in mind is that typical support may not cover certain areas, such as advanced customizations, special projects, or integrations outside the original implementation scope. So always best to confirm what's included in your package, what might require separate agreements so you're avoiding surprises later on.
There's that slide on comprehensive support. I thought there was a couple of polls that popped up. So if you see those polls, please feel free to vote. Thank you. Next slide. We'll try to wrap this up. I know we're coming up on time. Post-implementation success. Certainly, I'll jump to number 2. Post go live would be important to understand if you have a large organization, especially things like activation rate, churn. In other words, anyone stopped using the system, how many folks are actively using the system, and then running internal net promoter score surveys, just to understand satisfaction. Typically, implementations, not everything's going to go smoothly all the time. But if we do it right, you go live, you go through the last little bit of hurdles, and then we're off to the races. Jim, I think we're coming up on time here. Thank you all for joining. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or any concerns. Jim, you want to take it from here?
Sure. So I know some folks have hopped off and had to go to some other calls. But I want to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. If you have any questions, reach out to me or the team at any time, and you can see our contact info there. So our final session in our 2024 Not-for-Profit Speaker Series will be on December 4th, which is the 2024 tax update, where we're going to cover changes to the IRS Form 990 for the upcoming tax year, current IRS compliance priorities and examination programs that impact not-for-profit organizations, and highlights from the IRS strategic plan related to the tax-exempt sector. So we value your feedback and ask that you take part in a short survey, which will appear when you leave the session. So just a reminder that recordings will be available in about a week. So thanks everyone very much.